Jeffrey McKee, his last name, and Valley Emergency Medical Services, 764 Derby Avenue in Seymour, Connecticut.
Can you please tell the lady on the jury what you do for a living?
So I'm a paramedic providing advanced life support. I've been working with Valley Emergency Medical Services for a little over 4 years. And prior to that, I was an EMT for about 10 and a combat medic in the Connecticut National Guard.
Did you have to go through any training or education to be a paramedic?
I did. I went through just about 18 months worth of didactic and skills training, as well as clinical at Capital Community College to obtain my paramedic license.
And what's the difference between a paramedic and an EMT?
So an EMT does what's called basic life support, where they can perform CPR, administer oxygen, basic medications, and do very basic assessments of patients.
And what is a paramedic do?
As a paramedic, we're a more advanced level of care where we can initiate IVs, we can intubate, provide advanced airways, and give a bunch of medications that we're trying to give.
And how long have you been a paramedic?
I've been a paramedic for just over 6 years.
And I want to direct your attention to May 15th of 2022. Were you working that day?
I was,
In what capacity?
as a paramedic.
And did you have an occasion to respond to 43 Laurel Glen on that day?
I did.
Okay, and I want to direct your attention to States 1, where that red mark is right behind you on that exhibit right behind you. Is that the home, the residence that you responded to on that night?
Yes.
Now, what time did you say you arrived to the scene?
I arrived at the scene shortly after midnight.
And what was the information that you had in relation to responding to that scene at that night?
I was dispatched for a possible assault with possibly multiple victims on a priority 1 as the first incoming paramedic from out of town.
And what does priority 1 mean?
So it means lights and sirens.
And why would you put on lights and sirens?
It was reported as a critical call that required a paramedic or advanced life support to respond.
So what time would you say you arrived there?
I believe it was shortly after 20 after midnight, somewhere in that time frame.
And when you got there, I want to direct your attention to States 5. Stage 5, it's on your screen there. Is this the area that you responded to at 43 Laurel Glen?
Yes, it was.
And when you got there, can you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, if you can, in States 5, where you responded to? What did you do when you got there?
So upon arrival, there was a lot of individuals on scene as well as police and care providers. I was directed to the patient that was on the lawn, sort of where all the trash is to the right of that red bush.
When you got there, can you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what you observed?
So upon arrival, I observed a chaotic scene with a lot of younger individuals crying, screaming, upset, and I observed the Shelton ambulance on scene with a patient in the grass there performing CPR with a bystander as well as PD officers around. And that's the patient I was directed to. I know there was another paramedic on scene who had triaged, and that's the patient, my most critical patient I was directed.
Were you aware that there were other patients at the scene?
I was told there was en route to the scene, and there were providers on scene that directed me to the patient that was in the front lawn that you mentioned right there.
Okay, and when you got to that patient, can you tell us what care, if any, you provided to that patient?
I got the report from the EMT that was performing CPR on the patient, and he had placed an AED and an oral airway in the patient upon finding out that the patient was pulseless. So I had them continue CPR and connected them to my cardiac monitor via the AED pads that were previously placed. Did a brief pause, checked for a pulse, checked for breathing on the patient, as well as checked the initial heart rhythm, which was asystole. Upon doing that and determining there was no pulse and no breathing, directed CPR to be continued, as well as ventilation with oxygen.
What is asystole?
Asystole is essentially flatline, where there's no cardiac electrical activity originating on top of the heart or in the heart whatsoever.
When you got to the scene, what did you observe about the patient outside of your assessment of the patient medically? What did you observe about the patient?
The patient was a young male in his teens. The patient appeared to be in good shape, healthy.
Did you observe any wounds on the patient?
I did. I observed a small puncture wound right under the patient's left nipple in the area of the chest with a chest seal that was placed on there prior to my arrival.
Was there any active bleeding at that point?
There was bleeding in and around the site. The chest seal was doing a decent job of controlling that bleeding, and there was direct pressure being held on that upon my arrival.
When you assessed the patient at that point in time, and you said they were in asystole,
Yes.
what steps did you take at that point when you determined that CPR should continue and there was a flat line?
So at that point, I continued my trauma assessment on the patient to determine if there were any other wounds or hemorrhage that needed to be stopped, while the EMT partner and the other provider provided quality CPR to the patient. And then if there was any additional bleeding that needed to be rectified before moving the patient.
How long would you say that you were on the scene providing medical care to that patient when you got there?
No more than 15 minutes from the time I made patient contact to getting the patient in the back of the ambulance and starting transport.
Did you determine that the patient needed to be transported to the hospital?
I did.
Why did you determine?
I determined that because upon arrival of the first responders, they said the patient still had a pulse, a palpable pulse, and just prior to my arrival that had been lost. So it's technically what's called a witnessed arrest, which a provider witnessed the cardiac arrest. So there's still a chance for us to provide life-saving measures, and that's what I did.
And at some point, you transported the individual to the hospital?
Yes.
Okay. And what did you do between the time you placed them on a backboard, put them in the back of the ambulance and transported them to the hospital? What life-saving measures, can you explain what you did at that point?
So once we got the patient off of where they were found into the back of the ambulance, I noticed that the chest seal was not holding well. So I replaced that to stem the continued bleeding. CPR continued. I attempted to get IV access on the patient. However, his vasculature did not support IV access, which I went to what's called an intraosseous infusion, which is a drill through the tibial tuberosity on the left leg, where you can infuse medications, fluid directly into the bone marrow.
You're in the back of the ambulance. Who's driving?
So one of the EMTs was driving to the hospital.
And you tried to administer medication in the patient's veins?
And through the intraosseous infusion.
No, why did you do that? Why did you do an intraosseous? Can you explain that to the jury?
Yes, so I did an intraosseous infusion because the patient did not have veins or vasculature that was apparent to me, either due to hypovolemia, which is lack of fluid or blood, or poor vasculature. So in an emergency situation like that, the next choice is to do an intraosseous infusion in through the bone marrow.
Okay, and how do you do that? Can you just explain that to the jury?
So it is a needle attached to a drill, and you use the drill to drill through the outer layer of bone in the select spot. And once it is through that first layer of bone, you stop and you're able to flush into the bone marrow with fluid or medication.
And why is that? Why are you trained to do it that way?
So we're trained to do that way in the instances that you cannot get an IV and that there's no vasculature available to obtain an IV while still being able to provide care, to provide emergency care.
And when you provide medicine in that manner, does it get into the body faster?
It does. So it travels through the bone marrow directly into the heart and then to the rest of the body once it's pumped through the vasculature.
And you did that in this case?
Yes.
And what medication did you provide the patient at this point?
I provided epinephrine, which is our standard advanced cardiac life support drug to try to resuscitate a patient that's in cardiac arrest.
And in this particular instance, after you applied that epinephrine, was it successful in reviving a type of heart?
It was not.
Can you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what you continued to do on the ride from 43 Laurel Glen to the hospital?
Absolutely. On the transport down, I continued to give epinephrine every 3 to 5 minutes with a total of 4 doses to try to restart the patient's heart. I also continued CPR on the way down, and when the chest seal was no longer effective, applied a pressure dressing, which stemmed the bleeding that was continuing and stopped the bleeding with that. I also intubated the patient to get a definitive airway, which was confirmed on my cardiac monitor and listening to it as well. So ventilation while after being intubated, as well as CPR continued, as well as a normal saline drip to try to put some volume back into the patient.
When you initially got to the scene and you assessed the patient, did the patient have a pulse on the scene when you saw?
When I got to the patient, they did not.
From the time you left 43 Laurel Glen to the time you got to Bridgeport Hospital, did you assess the patient for a pulse during that period of time?
I did. Every 2 minutes I assessed for a pulse. I also assessed for any cardiac rhythm or activity on my cardiac monitor, which the patient remained in asystole throughout the transport at that every 2 minute interval.
How long would you say, if you can recall, the ride to the hospital was from 43 Laurel Glen to Bridgeport Hospital?
It felt to be between 15 and 20 minutes.
At some point in time, did you arrive at Bridgeport Hospital?
We did.
And can you explain what happened when you arrived at Bridgeport Hospital?
So when we arrived just prior, I had given a trauma alert patch to the hospital, advising them what I had found on scene, what interventions I had done on the way down, and what to expect when we arrived. When I got there, CPR continued into the emergency department. We rolled into the trauma room and CPR continued throughout that process. I had the attending doctor and the respiratory therapist confirm my intubation and my tube placement. that it was accurate. And I gave a report to the attending physician and nurses that were there. And then the patient was moved over to the hospital bed and the staff continued their resuscitation process.
And at the time that you handed the patient off to the hospital, at that moment, did you do any final assessment as to any type of pulse or activity with regards to
I did. Just prior to bringing them into the ED, I did final pulse, breathing, and cardiac rhythm check. The patient remained in asystole, remained pulseless, and remained not breathing. So we continued CPR from the ambulance in through the ED with the ED staff taking over CPR.
I have no further questions.
Thank you. Attorney Smith, any redirect? Any cross?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. McKee. Just want to go over what you've told us here and make sure I got this correct. When you responded to the scene, you encountered a chaotic scene. Is that fair to say? People screaming?
Yes, crying, yes.
And did you have any trouble getting to the patient?
I did not.
Path was cleared for you at that point?
Yes,
You were directed to this patient by other responders that were already on the scene?
yes,
You told us that you did an initial trauma assessment, correct?
yes,
That included trying to find whether or not there were any other wounds, correct?
correct.
You didn't find any other wounds, did
I
you?
did not.
You also looked for other bleeding, correct?
Yes,
Didn't find any other bleeding, correct? You looked for other trauma, is that fair to say?
yes,
And you didn't discover any other trauma?
No.
Just what you've noted as being a small wound, one small puncture wound to his chest under the nipple, I believe, correct?
correct.
Did you see any signs of alcohol or drinking when you got to the scene?
I did not notice.
Do you recall the conditions that evening? Was it rainy, misty?
It was misty. The roads were damp.
The grass itself, do you recall whether or not the grass was wet?
It was damp.
That caused you to slip or anything while you were setting up?
No.
And then you described for us the level of support that you gave to the patient, correct?
Yes,
And that, I believe you told us, at some point you determined that he needed transport, correct?
correct.
And you determined he needed transport because it was what you described as a witnessed arrest, correct?
Correct.
Meaning that the people who had responded to the scene had gotten some indication of a pulse, correct?
Yes,
And some heart activity, correct?
yes,
And however, by the time you arrived, there was this witnessed arrest, which meant that there was still a chance to provide life-saving measures, correct?
yes.
And that's why you determined it was time to take this patient, transport him to Bridgeport Hospital, correct?
That is why.
Which you did, and then you transferred care once you were there over to the attending physicians,
I
correct?
did.
And so, Mr. McKee, you've been brought here today, fair to say, to tell us what you witnessed and observed when you arrived on the scene.
Correct.
But if this jury was interested in knowing why Mr. Valle did what he did that night, you wouldn't be able to help them at all, would you?
I would not.
Thank you.
Does the state have any redirect?
No, Your Honor, thank you.
Thank you. Sir, you may have
Thank you.
Thank you.